So it's been a while since we've done an official theory video. I think this one is long overdue. One of the constants of One Piece is that Oda leaves us enough to figure out practically any mystery. Not to say that we will, but you can, so we're gonna try. So right now a question is nagging at me. How will Oda explain the God's Knights and potentially the Gorosei's immortality? This question, in my opinion, is pretty important because at some point we need to defeat them. And right now, I think that we know enough to make an educated guess as to how this might work. So strap yourselves in, apply your tinfoil liberally. Let's begin. Hey YouTube, Joeboy here. So for those who want a brief refresher, right, in the most recent chapters of One Piece in Elbaf, we've learned that the God's Knights are immortal, they can't be killed. Usopp even managed to explode half of Gunko, and she just reformed. But despite this being a pretty intimidating power, it's also something that we've seen before, at least we think that we've seen before, from the Gorosei, who are also immortal. Full disclosure, we don't actually know that the Gorosei and the God's Knights are immortal in the same way. I just think that it's a fair guess, and there's a lot about it that seems remarkably similar. So we're going based on that assumption. And I think just intuitively, the God's Knights and the Gorosei are connected. We literally just saw the leader of the God's Knights get promoted directly to Gorosei. In terms of the hierarchy of the world government, you have secretly Imu, below Imu is the Gorosei, and below the Gorosei is the God's Knights. So I kind of look at the Gorosei and the God's Knights as being pretty much the direct subordinates of Imu. These are the two groups that for sure know that Imu does in fact exist. It's not just a legend, this is their king. And it's for this reason that I like to believe that Imu has granted both the Gorosei and the God's Knights additional abilities. So basically, I think everybody is immortal because of Imu, in one way or another. The short story here is I think that at the very least, we're going to learn a bit about the nature of the Gorosei here in Elbaf through the members of the God's Knights. And I suppose Scopper is going to be our teacher. It seems likely to me. Alright, so now we have our question articulated as best as I can. Now we need some place to begin. Maybe it's just me, but if you're wondering how we're going to defeat the God's Knights and the Gorosei, then an appropriate question might be, what are they in the first place? And interestingly, Brooke seems to be under the impression that they might be zombies. And this joke, if you want to call it that, has now spanned 2 chapters. Mentioned earlier that Oda likes to leave clues? This could be one. Seems like a good place to start to me. The nice thing about zombies is we've already seen them in the story with Thriller Bark and Gecko Moria's powers, and their existence was explained to us. But I think that there's probably going to be a lot of you out there that'll knee-jerk to this idea as like, no, they're clearly different from the zombies in Thriller Bark. Clearly. But I want you to be patient for just a moment. We're going to go about this in a very traditional Joy Boy Theories way by discussing the meaning of life. I'm sure you're pumped. I am too. The way life itself works is very strange. Brooke is a prime example of this. In the world of One Piece, your body does not need to be alive, like a beating heart and all the things that are essential to life as we know it. It's not required. As far as we are aware, there are 2 different things which grant life. And the first that we're going to discuss is the soul. Oda has literally been bashing us over the heads with this in so many different ways, and that's why you know that the concept of the soul is crucial to the world building of One Piece. We could talk about Brooke, but I want to begin with Big Mom because Big Mom possesses the soul fruit. Firstly, lifespan and soul are synonymous terms. Big Mom, using her devil fruit, extracts people's souls if they are afraid of her, but this amounts to what she refers to as lifespan. She could take the whole thing or part of it, and then she can give this lifespan or soul to literally anything, inanimate objects, and it brings them to life. But I also want to make sure that I say this. These things that Big Mom brings to life also are given a personality. We know this for a fact because there is no way that the random cupcakes on Whole Cake Island had a personality before Big Mom gave them a bit of soul. So with the soul also comes personality. This is why Just Bones Brooke is alive, despite the fact that that makes no sense, right? All that is required to be alive is to possess a soul. I think that this is also related to Trafalgar Law's abilities that he showcased in Punk Hazard, the ability to personality swap. He moved one person's soul into another person's body, and vice versa. But anyway, to backtrack to where we were beforehand, really what I'm trying to explain to you is the things which make up a life form in the world of One Piece. Typically, you need a body or a vessel, and you need a soul. And the two fruits which characterize these aspects of life are Big Mom's Soul Fruit and Trafalgar Law's Opi Opi no Mi. Honestly, it's because of this that I pair Law's fruit and Big Mom's fruit together. One fruit makes somebody the master of the soul, and the other fruit makes somebody a master of the body, both a living body or inanimate objects. It's almost a sub-classification of fruit which makes a user a master of life, broken down into its fundamental aspects. But this is where the zombies come in, because we haven't yet talked about shadows. I implied earlier that all you need to be alive is a body and a soul, but that is not technically true. You also need a shadow, or else the light of the sun will disappear you. And it also happens to be true that you don't actually need a soul at all to be technically alive. A body and a shadow will suffice. For whatever reason, your shadow becomes a pseudo-soul, meaning if you have one, it kind of makes the soul unnecessary. I want you to keep this in mind going forward. You do not need a soul to be alive if your body previously possessed a soul and formed a shadow. But this is also where it starts to get a little bit convoluted. Maybe some of you out there are confused about the nature of life just because, look, if you have a soul, right, and you die, your soul leaves your body, you then have a body and a shadow. Why aren't you still alive? Oda's internal logic for this is that your shadow cannot exist and give life without a living soul to pair with it. All of this was explained in Thriller Bark. Basically, Moria has the shadow fruit, and he could forcibly remove people's shadows, then give those shadows to undead bodies, bringing them to life. But for all of this to work, the people whose shadow Moria took had to stay alive. If the soul and body which originally cast the shadow died, then the shadow would go with him. So a shadow can grant life. It just requires a soul to do this. So now that this is explained, I feel like this is the right moment to kind of start theorizing. We began this whole section with an observation that Brooke called Gunko a zombie. Good launching off point, right? Is this even possible? Can the God's Knights be zombies? And what does that mean? So in my opinion, the simplest way to define a zombie is a living being which does not directly possess a soul. So if we are speculating that the God's Knights are zombies or like zombies, essentially we're speculating that they do not possess a soul. They are shadow and body. Is such a thing possible? In my opinion, yes. So we know for a fact that the Gorosei's immortality and their life is tied to Imu, because Imu ended Saturn from literally thousands of miles away. So now let's combine some theories. I think that the most popular theory for Imu's abilities is that Imu is literally the devil. I don't really feel compelled to go all out and explain this theory. I feel like everyone pretty much gets it. But if that's not the case, then let me know in the comment section. So next time that we make a video like this, I will actually explain it good. But Imu as the devil is intuitive and obvious to me, and currently the best theory. More specifically, I believe him to be the devil of the sea, which is a named mythical creature in the world of One Piece. But this clarification really isn't necessary. If Imu is the devil, then we can look at occult lore and potentially give him some powers. But if you really want to understand what I'm thinking, watch Supernatural. And any Supernatural fans out there, shout out. There's so much lore relating to the devil, some of it is contradictory, so the bits and pieces that Oda might choose from to give to Imu, like, we can't be 100% certain. But I think that if you have a devil character in the story of One Piece, you almost definitely have a deal with the devil, or a contract with the devil. Typically, the way that it goes is the devil gives you something that you want, and the price for this is normally your soul. So in my opinion, this is how Gunko and the other God's Knights and the Gorosei can be like a zombie without literally being a zombie. They gave their souls to Imu. What we see walking around is shadow and body. And I also think that this works with the lore that we already have about shadows. Shadows require a soul to exist. If the original soul dies, then the shadow goes with it. So I think that it's fair to speculate that Gunko's soul is not gone. It's not dead. It's simply owned by Imu. And just the same as Saturn, Imu can end Gunko and all of the others whenever they want to. But anyway, I'm sure that astute followers right now will notice some holes in this theory or things that we haven't appropriately explained yet. So let me try to make the picture a little bit clearer. We've explained how these people might be like zombies, but we really haven't explained why they are immortal or how they're able to regenerate. So I guess I want to remind you of something that we said earlier. We said that the soul is synonymous with lifespan. The soul contains the clock that is ticking down to your end. However, zombies do not possess a soul. They are merely the combination of a body and a shadow. So hypothetically, it could be impossible to kill a zombie. And honestly, I think that that was all but confirmed in Thriller Bark. Really, in Thriller Bark, we got two ways of definitively dealing with zombies. And both of them were more about detaching the shadow from the body, rather than literally killing the zombie. The first method involved salt, which is actually really fitting if you go back to occult lore. Again, if you need a reference point for this, watch Supernatural. Salt, very important. But in One Piece, shove enough salt down a zombie's throat and the shadow abandons ship. The other way that this was accomplished is if you totally destroy the zombie's body, such as what Zoro did with Ryuma. The shadow needs a body to attach to. Without a body, the shadow has no home, and the zombie is effectively killed. So it's about here that we should probably point out the difference, at least the difference as I see it, between Gunko and a zombie. The zombie's shadow was not their own. It was the shadow of another person given to them by Moria. But if the deal with the devil is true, then really, the Gorosei and the God's Knights gave up their souls, but their bodies and their shadows are their own, which I think could end up mattering. As just an example, I really doubt that if you shoved salt down Gunko's mouth, that she would die. So if there's not a good way to detach the shadow from the body, then I do think that the Gorosei and the God's Knights are impossible to kill, because Imu is protecting their soul or their life force. But yeah, we really still haven't explained the regeneration. Like I said, one way of defeating a zombie is to literally destroy the body. No body, the shadow has nothing to attach to. But this is also an important difference between a zombie and Gunko or Saturn. Zombies do not regenerate. So the way that I'm going to tackle this problem is explain to you the true power of a shadow. Honestly, I think that people have forgotten just how overpowered shadows are. On one hand, Thriller Bark is not most people's favorite arc, and on the other hand, Moria kind of wasted his abilities. But we actually never figured out how to defeat a shadow in Thriller Bark, and shadows were pretty much invincible. The evidence for this comes mostly from Moria himself, and specifically his doppelman or his shadow. But Luffy fought a bit against Moria's shadow, and there was nothing that he could do to that thing. As far as I'm aware, it was never even damaged. But I suppose more importantly, for the sake of this theory, the shadow has certain abilities if you have the means to control it. One of these is that your shadow can take any shape. The Doppelman broke into brickbats and did all sorts of other shenanigans. Honestly, in part, it was kind of the reverse of a Logia type or the reverse of Katakuri. You know, where normally you try to move your body away from the incoming attacks or in some way your form is intangible. Well, in the case of Moria's shadow, he intentionally broke the shadow up to intercept Luffy's attacks, which could do nothing to the shadow. Honestly, at some point, I hope that we get some sort of pure shadow entity at some point in time because, again, shadows are broken. But I do think that the Gorosei, the God's Knights, Gunko, and Saturn are body and shadow, and I think that this was pretty much confirmed with Saturn because after Imu killed him, a skeleton remained. So Saturn had a body within whatever he was. They aren't just pure shadow. So really, we should be talking about the powers of a shadow in combination with a body. I don't know if it's possible for anybody else to do this, but Moria could fully detach his own shadow and then swap places with the Doppelman. I'm definitely not going to die on this hill, but Moria had a form of teleportation involving his own shadow. And you could potentially draw some comparison between this ability and the ability of the Gorosei and the God's Knights to use the portals. And maybe at some point in the future of this video, we'll talk a little bit about the summoning circles and the symbols. I just want you thinking about how Moria's literal body, his living body, teleported from one place to another. But the more important ability of the Shadow that we need to discuss is the Shadow's ability to manipulate the body. This was demonstrated most clearly with Ors. Ors couldn't control his own shadow, but Moria could control his shadow and alter the shape of Or's body. There was a running joke about Ors having Luffy's shadow and having some memory of being able to stretch, and he was like, I thought that I could stretch. And then utilizing his shadow, Moria made it happen. Guys, do you realize that we saw the Gorosei literally do this? Saturn's body was flexible, as if he were made out of rubber like Luffy. Stretching his limbs was one of his go-to moves. My theory is that Saturn was able to do this because Saturn can manipulate his own shadow. And I think that it's possible that we've seen Gunko do something very similar. Do you remember when her legs grew to giant size? And at the soles of her feet were flame-like shadow. I'm sure you're thinking, no, JB, this was just Moria's ability. Well, guys, I really don't think so. And I have a couple reasons why. So earlier in the video, we talked about the three aspects of life: the body, the soul, and the shadow. I believe that it's possible for life forms in the world of One Piece to control all three aspects individually. The soul is the most obvious one because I think that it directly relates to Haki. I think that Haki abilities are tied directly to your soul. Mastery over your own soul leads to Haki techniques and the Haki power system. But yeah, I'm unsure if I'm going to blow anyone's mind, but the body power system in the world of One Piece is kind of hiding in plain sight. Do you guys remember Kumadori and Seimei Kikan? The kabuki rabbit-looking dude from CP9 who could control his own hair? The official English translation of this ability was life return. This is what Kumadori had to say about it. Yo-yoi! A millennium in the sea, a millennium in the mountains, inhaling the wind, swallowing the mist. I lived as a hermit and completed my training. And lo, I mastered this life return technique. In nature, from the hair on one's head, from one's vital organs, to the tips of one's toes, even to the ends of one's quote-unquote short hairs. Not sure what that means. There is not a single spot that cannot be controlled with one's consciousness. And Chopper responds and helps clarify what this guy is trying to say. You can consciously control every part of your body, even your hair. I've read about something like this in a book. It's called biofeedback. So I just want you guys to be prepared for this. I think that it is incredibly likely that the Gorosei and the God's Knights have mastered life return. That could potentially explain their regeneration on its own. To me, it is not a coincidence that members of CP9, both Kumadori and Rob Lucci, have to some extent mastered life return, and these are agents of the government. This is a technique taught in world government spheres. The Gorosei should know it. And hell, there might even be some explicit foreshadowing. Kumadori talking about becoming a hermit and mastering this technique over a millennium. Guys, he is not 1,000 years old. That dude is 40. But we do have some 1,000-year-old beings here. However, my overall point is simply that the body has its own unique power system that can be mastered, similar but different to Haki. And honestly, I think that we've seen Luffy and Zoro use this already without necessarily calling it life return. It then stands to reason that the other fundamental aspect of a living being can also be manipulated in the same way. I think that shadow powers will eventually become something highlighted in the story. And for people lacking a soul, it might be essential. But yeah, I feel like we should say this while we're here. Did you guys notice that the Gorosei didn't really concern themselves with armament Haki? When they got attacked, they just broke into little pieces. We laughed about this in a recent chapter review, but did you think it was funny that Summers, one of the God's Knights, couldn't seem to sense that Chopper and Robin were in Saul's hair? I was like, does this dude not possess observation Haki? Well, maybe they don't. We've talked about how the shadow is an alternative, a substitute for the soul. It could potentially have similar but different abilities. And all this really works for me if you think about Brooke. Brooke was forced to master his own soul while living outside of his body, leading to many of the techniques that we see in the present story. It's then kind of intuitive to believe that the Gorosei, the God's Knights, were better able to master their own shadows in the absence of their souls. But anyway, guys, are you following what I'm trying to convey? Because it feels pretty persuasive to me. If you can become a master of your own body and do all sorts of crazy things, and you can become a master of your own soul and do all sorts of crazy things, why wouldn't that also apply to your shadow? Moria's fruit might have given him a head start to master his own shadow, and also given him the ability to manipulate other people's shadows. But shadow manipulation as a whole is possible for anybody, although it may be much more difficult, and therefore much less common. I have a feeling that a lot of people are going to be persuaded by my theory that the Gorosei and the God's Knights can use life return, and maybe that explains their regeneration. But just honestly, I think that the shadow is part of this as well. If the body can contort to fit the shadow, and a fighter possesses the ability to shape their own shadow, I think that that could help them regenerate. Almost like the shadow is reminding the body of what it should be like, or the shape it should have. So yeah, the theory that I'm laying out for you is that both the Gorosei and the God's Knights have made a deal with the devil, in this case Imu, and Imu now controls, possesses, and protects their souls. Because of this, they cannot be killed. Because of how broken shadows are, the only way this would be possible is by destroying their bodies, leaving their shadow with no home. But through mastery of their own shadows and mastery of their own bodies, this can't be accomplished either, leaving beings which simply cannot die due to damage. And as a fun fact, this could also potentially explain why Moria is not dead. There was a cliffhanger at the end of Marineford where we all thought that Doflamingo killed Moria, but then he just popped up later, alive and well. So I want to throw that in there as well. Moria could also have something like this going on. But yeah, believe it or not, there are still some issues with this theory. So I think that we need to explore the differences between the Gorosei and the God's Knights. Because despite the premise of this entire video up until now, they are not actually the same. Let's try and do this as quickly as possible. We know for a fact that Figurlin Garling has been a member of the God's Knights for a while. In the text box introducing him in the God Valley flashback, he is already a member of the God's Knights. So an assumption that we've been quietly making this whole time is that once you become a member of the God's Knights, you've already made a deal with Imu. And in the same way as Gunko, you are already immortal. That is a part of the lore of the God's Knights, is that they cannot be killed. So I spent this lead up telling you that the God's Knights and the Gorosei are the same, but this is one way in which they're different. Because we saw Saint Saturn during the God Valley flashback, and we obviously saw him in Egghead, and he looks exactly the same. But this is not true of Figurlin Garling. During God Valley, Figurlin Garling looked young, and since that point, he has aged. Sometimes there's a fine distinction in the words that you use. There is a difference between eternal youth and immortality or invulnerability. You may be unable to kill a member of the God's Knights, but they have some finite lifespan, and they do age. So in my opinion, there are two abilities at work here. The first ability prevents the God's Knights and the Gorosei from being killed. The second ability stops or slows down aging. I'm sure that you can already guess, but I believe this second ability to be the perpetual youth surgery of the Opi no Mi. The reason that the world government put an absurdly high price tag on the Opi no Mi and coveted this fruit basically as much as the Nika fruit is because it's largely been in their hands. It makes sense to me that the world government would give this fruit to somebody that they could control and then allow them to perform the perpetual youth surgery on the Gorosei. Or perhaps on Imu, who can then distribute this lifespan to the Gorosei. We still don't know exactly how this ability works because Law has not performed it, right? And we can only speculate. But my theory going on 10 years now is that Law essentially can give his soul to somebody else, which is why the ability costs his life. But if you recall, soul is also lifespan. So if he gives his soul to somebody else, they would live longer. That is how I think that it works. The short story here is the Gorosei possess something that the God's Knights don't. And I think that it's this. Hypothetically, you could do this over and over again to the point that the Gorosei have so much extra lifespan, they don't really need to worry about it. But obviously, there's some things here that you could potentially nitpick or not like because we simply don't know enough about the ability. All we truly know is that the Gorosei and the God's Knights are not exactly the same. I think that this could explain it. But yeah, this feels pretty technical and maybe kind of unnecessary, but I felt the need to acknowledge it. Really, the only thing left for us to discuss is, given all of this, how do we kill them? Or shoot, let's lower the bar. How do we stop them from fighting? How do we beat them? Seems like a good question to me. And I suppose that Scopper knows the answer. I'm not gonna lie to you, when I set out to make this theory in the first place, I had a really complex idea as for how this might work. Just like you already know I like to do it. But while recording this, I've kind of changed my mind. In the vast majority of cases, the simple answer is correct. Ignoring all the technicalities and the details, in Egghead, how were the Gorosei defeated? The answer was Joy Boy conquers Haki. At the same time, how do you think that Scopper was able to chop off Summer's arm so that it would not regenerate? The obvious answer is some form of Haki. So it doesn't take a genius to speculate that the way that we are going to defeat the Gorosei and the God's Knights is using Haki, specifically some form of advanced conqueror's Haki. So to me, honestly, this isn't all that interesting. The only place that it gets interesting is in the why. Why would Haki work? And my answer for that is energy. Guys, the entire story of One Piece is also about energy. In our current scientific understanding, life itself, like the life of a living being, a human being, is related to your mitochondria, the powerhouse of the cell. It's what provides you energy. Without any energy, you are dead. But in the story of One Piece, you don't need a living body as we understand it to be alive. All of this is accomplished with the soul. Your soul is the energy source which powers your life. And in my opinion, this pretty much explains that everything that Luffy does in the story. How often do we see in arcs where he pushes past his body's limits? I think that he's able to do this because he literally draws from the energy of his own soul. And I also think that this is why many of Luffy's abilities and fights end up costing lifespan. The lifespan is your finite amount of energy in your life, and Luffy burns it away to get back up and fight some more. So beings require energy to be alive, and we know that both the soul and the shadow grant life. Therefore, they both grant energy. However, I do not think that these power sources are equal. I think that the soul is more powerful than a shadow, which is just intuitive because the shadow really is the reflection of someone's soul. It's an imitation. So in my eyes, there's something symbolic about the relationship between Brooke and Gunko here in Elbaf. Brooke is the Soul King, a person with a dead body, but mastery of his own soul. And then opposite of him, you have Gunko, who does not possess a soul. She lives because of her shadow. So now that we know that she idolizes Brooke, this has more than one meaning. We've known for quite a long time now that you can use your own soul, or you can use Conqueror's Haki to subdue the souls of others, souls that are weaker than yours. This is what makes a king. And through Moria, we learned it is possible to subdue shadows in perhaps a similar way. Of course, we attribute this to his Devil Fruit abilities, but Gecko Moria could control the shadows that he harvested from other people. He became their king. I'm not gonna lie to you, in part, I do not like this theory, because I like the idea that the Gorosei are Yonko level fighters. But the reality is they are not kings. They are slaves. Slaves to Imu, whatever, they are subservient. So I'm just wondering out loud if you can tell their shadows what to do. Not just Imu, but others as well. If somebody can resist the effects of Conqueror's Haki because of the power or energy of their own soul and overpower those weaker than them, it might also apply to the Gorosei and the God's Knights. Essentially, in a battle of energy, the shadow loses. Potentially, there's also an element of fear to this as well. When Zoro looks at Monet, he terrifies her. And to many people, this was the first time that Zoro demonstrated some form of Conqueror's Haki. Could something like this be happening between Scopper Gabon and Saint Summers? The fact that Summers is afraid could matter. Perhaps it is not a coincidence that in Egghead, ultimately what defeated the Gorosei was Imu was afraid of Joy Boy, or as Scopper developed a technique which allows him to literally cut somebody's shadow. But it just seems likely to me that the solution is Haki. The strongest people on the planet have a soul. Regardless of what other powers that the God's Knights or the Gorosei might have access to, lacking a soul is a big deal. And Gunko tells us straight up that her greatest fear is Nika. Nika, which has some connection to the Eternal Flame, the greatest power source on the planet. But anyway, guys, I don't want to continue on all day. I feel like I said what I wanted to say, and I hope that this theory was compelling. Hopefully it's not debunked in one chapter. But yeah, guys, as always, I'm curious as to what you guys think. Leave your thoughts in the comments section below. If you're interested, check out my book, The Booms. Link is in the description. Like the video, subscribe, click the bell to be notified, join the squad, and as always, guys, have a wonderful day.